So, hello everyone. I'm a 32-year-old woman, my husband is 35, and we've been together a little over 6 years, married for 3 of those. From the outside, our relationship looked solid in a way people genuinely admired. We weren't flashy or dramatic, but we were stable, predictable, and safe, the kind of couple people use as an example when they talk about doing it right. We both had steady jobs, we rented a decent house in a quiet suburb, we hosted holidays and game nights, we posted normal boring couple photos where we looked happy without trying too hard. There were no obvious red flags, no cheating rumors, no screaming matches in public, no breakups or reconciliations, nothing that would make anyone worry about us. And for a long time, I believed that meant we were actually okay. If someone had asked anyone in our lives what our biggest issue was, they probably would have said something small and stupid, like he leaves his socks on the floor or we argue about whose turn it is to cook. That kind of low-stakes, everyday stuff that feels manageable and harmless. I thought we were lucky to have avoided the big problems. What I didn't understand yet was that the damage wasn't happening between the two of us. It was happening around us, slowly and quietly, wrapped in smiles and family dinners and people calling me sweetheart while slowly pushing me out of my own life. His family was the problem, even though I didn't have the language for it at the time. Mostly his mother, Linda, and his older sister, Rachel. His dad was technically present but functionally invisible, the kind of man who enables bad behavior by pretending not to notice it. When I first met them, nothing screamed danger. His mom was overbearing, sure, but she came off as warm and involved in a way that felt annoying rather than malicious. She asked a lot of questions, worried about everything, commented on things that weren't really her business, but I told myself that was just how some families are. She complimented me constantly, told me I was good for her son, hugged me every time she saw me, posted photos of us online with captions about how happy she was that Mark had found someone like me. At the time, I thought that meant acceptance. His sister was colder, but still subtle about it. She wasn't openly rude, just sharp and observant in a way that made me feel quietly judged. She'd make comments that sounded harmless on the surface but left a weird aftertaste, like telling me I was brave for wearing something or saying she could never let her husband talk to her the way Mark joked with me. I noticed it, but I didn't challenge it, because I didn't want to be the overly sensitive girlfriend reading too much into things. Mark warned me early on that his family could be a lot, but he always framed it like a shared inconvenience rather than a serious problem. He'd roll his eyes, shrug, and say things like, "That's just how they are," or "My mom can be intense, but she means well." I believed him, because I loved him and because he didn't seem controlled by them in obvious ways. He lived on his own when we met, had a job, paid his bills, and talked about his family like something he tolerated rather than depended on. As we got more serious, their presence in our lives increased. More dinners, more group chats, more opinions about things that weren't really their business, like where we should live, how often we should visit, what kind of house we should buy one day, when we should start having kids. None of it was presented as control, it was always concern, always love, always family. And Mark stayed neutral through all of it. That was his thing. He didn't openly defend them, but he didn't push back either. He'd tell me they didn't mean it that way, or that I was reading into it, or that it wasn't worth the drama to confront them. At the time, I mistook that for maturity. I thought avoiding conflict meant preserving peace, and I didn't realize that neutrality almost always benefits the loudest and most manipulative people in the room. When we got engaged, something shifted, even though I couldn't fully name it yet. The comments became more pointed, the involvement more intense, and the sense of entitlement more obvious. His mom started prefacing her expectations with phrases like, "Now that you're officially family," as if the engagement gave her ownership over our decisions. Wedding planning was miserable in a quiet, exhausting way, full of passive-aggressive comments, emotional manipulation, and constant pressure to compromise. She cried when we didn't choose her preferred venue, Rachel conveniently booked a vacation during our first-choice wedding date, and Linda insisted on inviting people I had never met because they had watched Mark grow up. Every time I got overwhelmed, Mark would comfort me, tell me he understood, and then ask me to compromise just a little more, just this once, just to keep the peace. I did, over and over, because I loved him and because I believed being flexible made me a good partner. We got married anyway. The day itself was beautiful, the photos looked happy, his mom cried during the ceremony, and Rachel gave a toast about welcoming me into the family. I remember thinking that maybe this was the turning point, that things would settle now that we were officially married. They didn't settle. They escalated. Marriage didn't create boundaries, it erased the illusion that I had any. His family started showing up unannounced, commenting on our finances, questioning my career choices, and offering unsolicited advice about our relationship in ways that felt invasive and inappropriate. I began to feel like a guest in my own marriage, like my role was to accommodate everyone else while quietly swallowing my discomfort. Every time I tried to talk to Mark about it, he'd listen, nod, tell me he agreed with me, and then do nothing. He promised to talk to them later, said confronting them would only make things worse, and asked me to be patient because he didn't want to be stuck in the middle. What I didn't realize yet was that there is no real middle when one side is actively hurting the other. He had already chosen where he stood. I just hadn't fully seen it yet. Part 2, the warning signs I kept excusing. Looking back now, this is the part that makes me feel the dumbest, not because I didn't notice anything, but because I noticed plenty and still convinced myself it wasn't serious. That's the part nobody really prepares you for, how good you can get at explaining away behavior that makes you uncomfortable when you want something to work badly enough. The first real warning sign showed up not long after we moved in together, before we were even engaged. Linda had a habit of inserting herself into our daily routines in a way that felt small but constant, like water dripping on your forehead. She'd text Mark multiple times a day asking what he ate, whether he slept well, if he was stressed at work, and if he didn't answer quickly enough, she'd escalate to calling him, then me. At first it felt almost funny, like wow, this woman really does not know how to let go, but over time it started to feel intrusive in a way I couldn't quite articulate. She'd show up unannounced under the excuse of just being in the neighborhood, even though we lived 20 minutes away from her. She'd open our fridge and comment on what we were eating, ask why we hadn't gone grocery shopping yet, or suggest meals she thought Mark preferred, even though he had never once expressed any dissatisfaction with what I cooked. If I said I was busy or tired, she'd laugh it off and say things like, well, marriage is about sacrifice, as if my boundaries were just cute suggestions she didn't have to respect. Rachel was quieter but sharper. She'd sit back during family gatherings and watch, then later make comments directly to Mark when I wasn't around. I know this because he'd repeat them casually, without realizing what he was doing. Stuff like, Rachel thinks you get stressed too easily, or Rachel says you might be taking things too personally. Every time, it was framed as concern, never criticism, and Mark would say it like he was just passing along helpful information, not realizing he was slowly letting her narrate who I was inside our relationship. I started feeling like I was constantly being evaluated by a committee that I never agreed to join. When we got engaged, the pressure ramped up in ways that were harder to ignore. Linda suddenly had opinions about everything, from my dress to our finances to how often I should be checking in with her now that I was marrying into the family. She'd call Mark and cry about feeling left out if we didn't invite her to something, even things that were objectively not family events, like date nights or trips we planned for ourselves. Then Mark would come to me looking exhausted and ask if we could just include her this one time to avoid the fallout. And here's where the dynamic really set in. Every single conflict turned into something I was supposed to manage emotionally. Linda would push, Rachel would comment, Mark would get stressed, and I'd be the one expected to absorb the discomfort so everyone else could stay comfortable. If I pushed back, I was labeled sensitive or dramatic. If I stayed quiet, it was proof that everything was fine. There were moments that should have stopped me cold, but instead I minimized them because I didn't want to be the woman who hates her in-laws. Like the time Linda told me, half joking but not really, that if Mark ever left me, she'd understand, because marriage is hard and sometimes people make mistakes. Or the time Rachel asked me, directly, what I would do if Mark decided he wanted something different in life, then followed it up with, I just think it's good to be realistic. I told myself they were just blunt. Or protective. Or socially awkward. Anything except intentional. The worst part was how Mark handled it, because he never outright dismissed me, which made it harder to argue. He'd listen, nod, agree that his mom could be too much, agree that his sister could be harsh, and then immediately follow it with reasons why confronting them would blow everything up. He'd say his mom was fragile, that Rachel was just stressed, that his family had been through a lot, and that he didn't want to create unnecessary conflict over things that weren't that bad. Slowly, without realizing it, I started editing myself. I stopped bringing things up right away. I rehearsed conversations in my head and then decided they weren't worth it. I started wondering if maybe I really was too sensitive, if maybe I had unrealistic expectations about how families work. I noticed that I felt anxious before family gatherings and relieved when they were over, but I told myself that was normal. The first time I truly felt scared was when I realized how much information about our relationship they had that I had never given them. Linda knew when we argued. She knew when Mark was stressed. She knew things about my insecurities that I had only shared privately. That meant Mark was venting to her, even though he insisted he wasn't. When I asked him directly, he brushed it off and said she just picked up on things. But she didn't pick up on things. She was being fed information. And Rachel knew too. She'd reference conversations Mark and I had in private, phrasing them like assumptions but clearly fishing for confirmation. I started feeling like nothing in my marriage was actually contained within it, like everything was being filtered through his family before it came back to me. I tried to set boundaries, gently at first. I suggested we limit visits. I asked Mark not to share certain things with them. I asked him to shut down comments about my character or choices. Every request turned into a conversation about timing, tone, and whether it was really necessary. He agreed with me in theory but delayed in practice, always asking me to wait until things were calmer, until his mom wasn't stressed, until Rachel wasn't going through something. There was always a reason not to act. By the time I realized how deeply uncomfortable I was already isolated. My friends noticed I was quieter, more anxious, but I brushed them off because I didn't want to badmouth my husband's family. I still believed that if I tried hard enough, if I was patient enough, if I proved myself long enough, things would eventually settle. What I didn't understand yet was that this wasn't about misunderstandings or adjustment issues. This was about control, and control doesn't get better with patience. It gets worse. The moment I stopped being just uncomfortable and started being afraid came later, when I discovered proof that what they were doing wasn't accidental or emotional or reactive, but coordinated. That's what part 3 is about, the moment everything clicked into place and I realized my marriage wasn't just being strained by my in-laws, it was being actively sabotaged from the inside. Part 3, Discovery and Realizing That Wasn't Accidental. I didn't discover what they were doing because I went looking for it. I need to make that clear, because I know how people like to rewrite women's stories once they realize the situation is ugly. I wasn't snooping, I wasn't suspicious, and I wasn't trying to catch anyone in something. I was just trying to function inside what I thought was my marriage. It happened on a random Sunday afternoon, the kind of day where nothing feels urgent and your brain is half on autopilot. Mark had gone out to help his dad with something, which was normal, and I stayed home to clean and do laundry. His laptop was on the kitchen table because he'd been using it earlier, open and plugged in, not locked or hidden or anything weird like that. I wasn't touching it. I walked past it to grab a drink and saw an email notification pop up across the screen. It was from his mom. The subject line said, "Next steps." That alone made my stomach tighten, because it wasn't written like a casual message. It sounded like a plan. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I stood there staring at the fridge for a good 30 seconds trying to convince myself it was none of my business. But then another notification popped up, and I saw Rachel's name underneath it, replying to the same thread. That's when my body moved before my brain could stop it. I sat down. I told myself I'd just glance, just confirm it wasn't something stupid like planning a birthday or organizing a family trip. I clicked. What I found still makes my hands shake when I think about it. It was a long email chain, and it had been going on for months. Not one or two messages, but dozens, maybe more, spread out over time like this was an ongoing project. The subject line had changed slightly over time, but the tone never did. Strategic. Calm. Detached. They were talking about me. Not in a vague, emotional way, but like a problem that needed to be managed. Linda wrote about how she was concerned that I was isolating Mark from his family, even though we saw them constantly. Rachel replied agreeing, saying she had noticed I was controlling the emotional environment and that Mark seemed different since marrying me. There were bullet points. Actual bullet points, listing behaviors they didn't like, moments I had supposedly mishandled, comments I had made that they found alarming. They referenced arguments Mark and I had in private, quoting things I had said word for word. They discussed my tone, my reactions, my boundaries, like they were diagnosing a personality disorder. And then came the part that made it clear this wasn't just venting. They were coaching him. There were messages where Linda suggested specific phrases Mark should use with me, ways to frame conversations so I'd feel heard while still getting me to back down. Rachel suggested timing confrontations for moments when I was already tired or overwhelmed, because I'd be more likely to drop it. They talked about reinforcing the idea that I was overly sensitive, that I misinterpreted intentions, that I had unrealistic expectations of marriage. One message from Linda said, and I will never forget this, if she feels like she's the problem, she'll either adjust or remove herself. Either way, the situation resolves. I felt ice cold. Then I saw something worse. They knew things about Mark that I didn't. There were references to debts he hadn't told me about, mistakes he'd made at work that he had downplayed, and emotional issues he'd shared with them but not with me. Rachel even mentioned a previous relationship of his that ended badly, framing it as evidence that this pattern repeats when he's with women like her. Women like me. That's when it hit me that this wasn't just about them disliking me. This was about control, about keeping him tethered to them, about making sure that no matter what happened in our marriage, they remained the authority. And Mark wasn't just aware of it. He was participating. Not actively, not aggressively, but passively enough that it still counted. He replied to their emails. He thanked them for looking out for him. He said he felt torn and stressed, but he never once told them to stop. He never defended me. He never said they were crossing a line. He let them rewrite our marriage without me in the room. I sat there for a long time, reading and rereading messages, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I felt like I had stepped sideways into a reality where everything I thought was private had been quietly monitored and judged by people who smiled at me to my face. When Mark came home, I didn't confront him immediately. I watched him move around the house, talking about his dad, asking what I wanted for dinner, acting like everything was normal. And that was almost worse than the emails themselves. Because it meant he could live like this. Compartmentalize. Smile. Pretend. That night, lying in bed next to him, I realized something that terrified me more than anything else so far. If his family could do this, and he could allow it, then I was never actually safe inside this marriage. Part 4 is where I confront him, where I realize how deep the gaslighting goes, and where he finally has to choose whether he's my partner or theirs. Part 4, Confrontation and Final? I didn't confront Mark right away after reading those emails, not because I was trying to be strategic, but because my body felt like it had entered survival mode and everything inside me needed a minute to catch up. I walked around the house for hours that night feeling like a stranger in my own space, replaying conversations, facial expressions, moments I had dismissed as harmless, and realizing they had all been part of something much larger and much uglier than I ever imagined. When I finally decided to talk to him, it wasn't dramatic or explosive the way people expect these moments to be, because I was exhausted in a bone-deep way that made yelling feel impossible. I waited until the next evening, after dinner, when we were sitting on the couch and the house was quiet, and I told him I needed to talk. His whole posture changed immediately, not with concern, but with tension, like someone bracing for impact while hoping they could still control the direction of the conversation. I asked him, calmly at first, why his mother and sister were involved in our marriage in ways I never agreed to, and why they had access to private conversations and details about me that I had never shared with them. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he asked how I knew that, which told me everything I needed to know about where his priorities were. When I told him I had seen the emails, his face drained of color, and for a brief moment I thought I might finally see real accountability, but it disappeared almost instantly. He rubbed his face, sighed heavily, and said he was disappointed that I had gone through his laptop, like that was the real betrayal in the room. That's when the gaslighting started in earnest, not loud or aggressive, but slow and methodical, the kind that makes you question your own sanity. He told me his mom was just worried, that his sister was protective, that families talk about things like this all the time, and that I was taking their words too literally. He said the emails weren't plans, just conversations, and that I was framing them in the worst possible way because I was already emotional. When I pointed out specific lines, specific phrases about manipulating timing and framing conversations to get me to back down, he said I was reading intent into things that weren't meant to be malicious. At one point, he actually said that if I hadn't been so sensitive in the first place, his family wouldn't have felt the need to step in, and I remember sitting there feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me because suddenly the narrative wasn't that they had crossed every boundary imaginable, but that I had somehow caused it by existing wrong. He told me he felt stuck in the middle, that I was forcing him to choose sides, and that it wasn't fair to ask him to cut off or confront his family when they had always been there for him. That was the moment I realized he wasn't confused or conflicted, he was comfortable letting them do the dirty work so he didn't have to be the bad guy. Every time I pushed for boundaries, he reframed it as me asking for something unreasonable, something extreme, something that would tear his family apart. He kept saying he loved me, that he wanted our marriage to work, but every solution he offered required me to shrink, to tolerate more, to be quieter, to stop reacting so strongly. I asked him directly if he was willing to tell his mother and sister to stop interfering in our marriage, to stop discussing me, to stop coaching him, and to respect our privacy. He hesitated for so long that the silence itself felt like an answer. When he finally spoke, he said he didn't think ultimatums were healthy and that maybe we should all sit down together and talk things through, which felt less like a solution and more like being dragged into a courtroom where I was already the defendant. After that conversation, something inside me shut down, not dramatically, but quietly, like a switch being flipped. I stopped arguing, stopped explaining, stopped trying to make him understand, because I finally understood something myself, which was that no amount of clarity or patience would fix a situation where my partner fundamentally did not see protecting me as his responsibility. I started emotionally pulling back without even consciously deciding to, and I could tell he noticed because he started accusing me of being distant, of shutting him out, of punishing him instead of working through things like an adult. The irony of that almost broke me. I spent the next few weeks feeling incredibly alone, even when he was sitting right next to me, because every interaction felt filtered through the knowledge that nothing about our marriage was actually just ours. I started doubting my own instincts, replaying conversations to see if I really had been too harsh or too demanding, and that self-doubt was honestly one of the most damaging parts of the entire experience. It's terrifying to realize how easily you can be made to feel disposable when the person who promised to prioritize you keeps choosing neutrality instead. The decision to leave didn't come during a fight or a dramatic revelation, but during a quiet morning when I realized I felt more anxious being married than I did imagining being alone. I was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee, reading another text from his mother about how we should all get together to clear the air, and it hit me that this would never end because he had no intention of stopping it. There would always be another conversation, another compromise, another request for patience, and I would slowly disappear in the process. So I told him I wanted a separation. He was shocked, not because he hadn't seen it coming, but because I think he genuinely believed I would always adapt. He accused me of giving up too easily, of destroying our marriage over family drama, of refusing to fight for us, and for a brief moment I almost folded, because being painted as the villain after everything still hurt more than I expected. But then I remembered those emails, the bullet points, the strategies, the way my discomfort had been treated like an obstacle instead of a warning sign. Leaving was messy and painful and lonely in ways I didn't anticipate, but it was also the first time in years that I felt like my thoughts were actually my own again. I started therapy, reconnected with friends I had slowly drifted away from, and began rebuilding a sense of self that wasn't constantly being evaluated or corrected. The emotional recovery hasn't been linear, and there are days I still feel angry or sad or embarrassed for staying as long as I did, but there's also a growing sense of relief that I no longer have to fight for basic respect inside my own marriage. So that's where I'm at now, sitting with the fallout, unpacking what happened, and trying to understand whether my expectations were ever unreasonable to begin with. Which brings me to why I'm here. Was I wrong to expect my husband to set boundaries with his family and prioritize our marriage, or was I asking for something any partner should be willing to do? I genuinely want to know, because right now I'm still trying to separate what was real from what I was trained to doubt.